Good afternoon. Today I will be doing a short presentation on my third year MSci research project, Taking at Face Value, looking at the validity of craniofacial photography superimposition in forensic science, and my supervisor was Dr. J. Silverstein. Firstly, what is craniofacial photography superimposition? This is a technique which incorporates a skull from an unknown set of remains and a face from a known photograph to assist in the identification of a set of unknown remains as a last result. Earlier in history, this technique was often used as an identification technique, for example the Ruxton case. This is one of the first documented cases in which ante-mortem images were compared with cranial remains. In 1935, expertly dismembered bodies were recovered from a river near Moffat in Dumfriesshire. The evidence was recovered, namely newspapers that body parts were wrapped in, indicating that they were from Morecambe and Lancaster, as these were the only locations where the paper was sold. Through further research, they identified the remains to be of two females, and at that time it had been reported that two females had gone missing in that area, Isabella Ruxton and a maid named Mary. Dr. Ruxton was the prime suspect, and upon his arrest, a search of his premises were made, where considerable evidence of the presence of blood staining were found. However, there was no proof that correlated it with the remains of the two women. In aid of the identification of Mrs. Ruxton, X-ray images were superimposed over the top of photographs of the victim. The first challenge to get the accurate scale of the portrait of Mrs. Ruxton. To do this, a staged photograph of the wedding dress and the tiara was superimposed onto the original portrait, as shown in the image below. The next step was to superimpose an ante-mortem images to the X-ray scans to identify whether the skull does in fact belong to Mrs. Ruxton or if it belonged to someone else. The superimposition indicated a positive identification due to the similarities of the known image of Mrs. Ruxton and the X-ray of the remains. This is in conjunction with all the other evidence gathered in the investigation, making it very likely to be her. In conclusion, after a difficult trial, Dr. Buck Ruxton was found guilty of murder of Isabella Ruxton and Mary Jane Rogerson. His penalty was execution by hanging. Since then, after extensive research, more reliable methods such as DNA and odontology have been discovered and utilized. These are far more reliable as identification methods. While conducting the initial research for this literature review, a number of areas were covered. These included looking at the photographic quality necessary for a good referencing image, facial thickness, including hard and soft tissue thickness, availability of alternative techniques like DNA testing, and a review of the limitations of craniofacial photography superimposition. To conduct the appropriate research on the aims of interest, numerous different sources were utilized within the research, but primarily peer-reviewed scientific journals. Different topics that impact the availability to conduct photographic superimposition were also reviewed, such as the photographic quality needed to get a good quality referencing image by way of CT or MRI scan of the remains. This can then be turned into a 3D image, which can in turn be compared to the image of a known individual. The main issue tends to lie with the quality of the known images, but there are enhancement methods that can be used to improve the images. By also identifying something of a known size in that image, you can use that as a scale in aid in the accuracy of the comparisons, like in the Ruxton case. Furthermore, an individual's face is not just made up of the skull, which is hard tissue. Other materials known as soft tissues make up the face, which give us visibly unique features to the individual's appearance. Depth markers can be used to give an indication of the average depth of the soft tissue on the face. Although this technique is good, not everyone has the same soft tissue thickness. Despite this, the technique can be used to determine an average thickness. It is important that this is factored in when superimposing an image onto a face and during facial reconstruction. Facial reconstruction is the prediction and the building of soft tissues, skin, and other parts of the face on the skull to aid in the identification of an unidentified person. There are a variety of techniques for the estimation of a face using dry skull. 2D representations put the face on top of a 2D image of the skull, whereas 3-dimensionals, as shown as the image above, is a manual construct of the face on a 3D skull. This is often done using clay directly onto a skull or a skull cast. There are two main techniques to reconstruct a face. The main being the Manchester method, also known as the landmark technique. This is the combination of the Russian method and the American method. It uses the shape of the skull as well as the tissue depth markers and landmarks on the skull in order to create a reconstruction. This is the most commonly used method today. Another technique is the morphological method for reconstruction, using judicial points. In some cases, they use software like 3D Studio Max to identify a morphological match and selected landmarks. By reconstructing a skull, a better indication of what the individual would have looked like can be achieved. This is especially beneficial in scenarios where hard tissue, normally used on its own in craniofacial superimposition, isn't enough and would be actively misleading when superimposed over an image. An applied study on the use of craniofacial photography superimposition of Private Charles McAllister. Research conducted by Dr. J. Silverstein showed two sets of remains of World War I soldiers that were recovered from a field in the Soissons region in France, who had gone missing in action in July 1918. The first set of remains were identified to be Private Francis Lupo, using primary evidence. This included a name engraved on a wallet found within the remains that matched the name recorded as a soldier missing in action from the fighting at this time. A match was also obtained using a family reference sample from a living niece related to Lupo, whose mitochondrial DNA matched a sample from a tooth. Therefore, the remains identified Lupo, who was then able to be buried in Arlington National Cemetery, Virginia, USA. For the second soldier, multiple lines of identification of the individual were conducted, including familial DNA comparisons, which suggested the unidentified remains did belong to Private Charles McAllister. However, to provide further proof for the original identification, superimposition of the mandible of the remains onto the image of McAllister was conducted. Anthropological subjective analysis conducted by myself of the jaw against an image suggests that there is an observational correlation regarding the shape of the jaw. It states in the anthropology report that the remains have a square jaw. This is a pronounced shaped jawline most common in males, and it is apparent that McAllister has a similarly shaped jaw, which is most defined on the left side. When superimposing the jaw onto Private Charles McAllister, the points of the face at which the hard tissue is most pronounced, the angle of the mandible, and the width of the mental protuberance, better known as the chin, aligned well with his remains. This provided more evidence that the remains are likely to belong to McAllister. After completion of my dissertation, the US government have finally accepted the identification. This means that the jaw is in fact Charles McAllister's. Therefore, he will be buried in Seattle, Washington, roughly 105 years after his death later this year. One particular study I came across during my research was conducted in South Africa. This study went into great detail reviewing a newly developed digital photographic superimposition using a representative sample of an African population. They concluded that the combined use of the morphological technique and the landmark-based techniques, as mentioned previously, are most effective strategy for the photographic superimposition. This inspired me to attempt to get a more accurate representation of a superimposition of a skull onto an image. To do this, my own head was scanned using an MRI scanner and then used to create a 3D representation of a skull that could then be 3D printed. This would have helped give an accurate and interactive interpretation of the issues of imaging and accuracy under the best possible circumstances. However, due to time constraints and issues with technology and resolution of scanning equipment, it was not possible for it to be completed. In conclusion, the pros of craniofacial photography superimposition include that it is extremely beneficial in scenarios where these other identification techniques cannot be applied, like in mass disaster situations or in more undeveloped countries. The future of craniofacial photography superimposition does likely involve artificial intelligence, with software like Skeleton ID being used to help speed up the analysis process. However, it is not reliable enough method to be used as a standalone identification method. Other identification techniques must be conducted as further confirmation, like DNA analysis and odontology must be used. In the future, further research and advancements are necessary for all components of craniofacial superimposition before it can be consistently incorporated into investigative strategies. Automatic systems could be created to overcome many of the issues as mentioned before. The most prominent issue could be reduced is the effect of human bias. Reduction of human bias would be an especially useful outcome of such automatic systems. Finally, the use of databases to hold the photographs of missing persons or measurements of unknown individual remains would be beneficial, so that comparative technology can be used to make a connection to the remains. However, the ethics of this would likely raise some other further concerns. Thank you so much for listening. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions. Thank you.